Half a day, my name's Kyra Perez, and welcome to the Guam International Film Festival 2022 Maker Panel Series. The Guam International Film Festival's mission is to foster the growth of cross-cultural understanding through the art of filmmaking. We achieve this by providing free film education and promoting cultural understanding throughout our communities, such as these panel series. For our panel today, we will be discussing film and war. Joining us on the panel are Valeriya Golovina, a Ukrainian filmmaker who has experienced firsthand the Russian invasion and occupation in her town and region. She gained her first experience in photography and journalism, covering the ongoing war with Russia for Ukraine's newspaper, Kiev Post. She earned her MFA in film at Victoria University of Wellington. Valeriya has directed short documentaries and video installations and worked as a cinematographer on more than a dozen narrative and documentary shorts. She's a GIF alum, having won the Grand Jury Award for Best Documentary Short last year. Michael is a Chamorro scholar, activist, author, producer, and editor. He currently serves as the museum curator for Guam Museum Foundation. Bevacqua founded the first ever Chamorro Studies program at the University of Guam in 2011, where he worked as a professor teaching the history of Guam and the Chamorro language for 10 years. He is a 2015 and 2018 GIF alum. Galvin Guerrero has spent over 2 decades in education in various capacities, including teacher, vice principal, principal, director, board member, and president. In that time, he has also worked with and mentored students in theater and film, having produced over 50 stage and film productions. In addition to several amateur films he posts on his YouTube channel, Galvin's professional film credits include Leaves, which he wrote, edited, and directed at New York University, along with Shithead Monica and Stand Up Neurotica. He has also directed and or produced 3 films in the We Drank Our Tears anthology that's available on Amazon. Moderating our panel today is Dr. Kirk Johson, longtime friend of GIF. Dr. Johnson's doctoral research while at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, took him back to the mountains of his youth, where he explored the influence of television on the lives of villagers in India. Dr. Johson and his wife then moved to the Pacific, where he has worked at the University of Guam as a professor of sociology for the past 2 decades. He has served as the director of the Bali Field School, a community development initiative since 2004, providing students an opportunity to explore through a cross-cultural lens the dynamics between tradition and modernity, globalization of the survival indigenous peoples and cultures, and highlights the complexity and tensions of the social change in the 21st century. Dr. Johnson's ongoing work in the Pacific Asia region has allowed him to learn firsthand about the processes of community development and capacity building at the grassroots in many different settings. With this, we'll hand it over to Dr. Johson.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Welcome, everyone. This is a wonderful space created by GIF to bring together these wonderful scholars, filmmakers, social change agents living in different parts of the world who explore the all-important reality of war through the lens of film and storytelling. I remember when I first moved to the Marianas and beginning to learn about the history of the Marianas, I read one author say that the present generation, even though we are so far removed from World War II, still experiences post-traumatic stress from World War II. That's how ever present war is here in Micronesia and sadly throughout the world. And our dear Valeriya is coming from the most recent place in the world that is struggling with the realities of war. And so having this space to reflect on not only the tragedies of war as humanity continues to struggle through its adolescence into maturity, and reflect so many of our childhood tendencies, to explore how we can understand, appreciate, and tell the stories of war, but with the vision of overcoming the realities of war. To come to that place in humanity's evolution where our swords will be turned into plowshares. So let's begin this conversation, and it's, I think, a free-flowing conversation. But let's begin with Valeriya, who's joining us at midnight from Ireland. And God bless her for staying up so late. And God bless Miguel for waking up so early on Guam. So Valeriya, let's turn it over to you. And maybe you could just share with us, since you're coming from and are working in the area of the world that is experiencing this terrible conflict, and we are reading about it every day, and people from all over the world are connected in various ways to that conflict. Maybe we hear from you first, and we'll begin the conversation there. Thank you, Valeriya.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks so much to Guam for giving me a space, to not only share my voice, but also speak for other people from Ukraine and for people who had to flee, like myself. Today, I'm a little bit, today is probably not the best day, for me to speak publicly, because Russia announced annexation of territories today, and my hometown is part of the region that's occupied, and my father is still staying there. So I'm a little bit, yeah, it's just a little bit difficult. So I just want to apologize if I'm not maybe making myself clear or anything like that. But yeah, I'm a filmmaker. I was living and working in Ukraine since last year after coming back from New Zealand, and I was at home when the war started and we were occupied, and I had to flee. I came to Europe. I'm staying in Ireland temporarily, and it's been tough. And I'm actively not doing any filming or any creative work right now that has to do, with the war in Ukraine. But I'm thinking that I'm still processing a little bit, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to approach it for me personally, as a filmmaker, as a human. But I just want to say that there are a lot of people and colleagues that I know who decided that, they want to film on the front lines. Some of them put their creative tools aside, and they actually went, to fight and defend the country in that way. And I think there's no right or wrong answer how you decide, to tell that story and what tools you're gonna use. So I'm a little bit in this process of searching how to use my creative voice a little bit more to perhaps do a project, or use cinema to tell. Maybe it will be my story, I don't know, but I'm still trying to process it before I decide to put it on screen.
Yeah, it is an interesting question. I think filmmakers who are in the war zone, who find themselves in the war zone, like yourself, this is your home. Some filmmakers go to war zones to tell stories, right? You're just hanging out with your family, and then suddenly your neighbor decides to invade, and so this question of how I think it's interesting to hear your story, because you're a filmmaker who's living their life, and then suddenly this huge neighbor invades and creates this incredible disruption in your country with this mass exodus. I had friends in Kiev as well who decided to stay for a time, a lady with a husband and 2 little children, and they were living in the basement of their apartment complex. The whole apartment complex was living in the basement with all the cars and stuff like this. And then after a few weeks, or a couple of months rather, she made her way to Germany. But maybe because you were part of this exodus, maybe you could just speak a little bit about what that experience was like. I mean, we saw it on the news and tried to kind of get our head around what that might have been like. Maybe you could just speak a little bit more about your experience. Where were you living? And those initial days and weeks, what that was like, and then what was the experience like to make your way into Europe?
Yeah, so at that, in February, I came to visit my family, and we live in a small town near the Azov Sea in the south, in Zaporizhia region. And I was staying there with my father kind of for a couple of weeks. And then we heard the news and everything, and we have relatives that lived in Donetsk. So we always felt very related to war because we've seen and heard from them what it's like to be occupied and what it's like, to be crossing a front line and checkpoints. So, I mean, for us, I remember my father woke me up around 6 a.m. on the 24th of February with the word saying, he said, Valeriya, get up. Russia is bombing Ukraine. And I said, what do you mean bombing? Because because I was thought, is it in Donetsk? Is it escalating from Donetsk? And he said, no, he said, all cities, he said, you need to get up. And then that whole morning was just in shock because the first thing I did, I went to a petrol station because I was like, well, I don't know, do we have to go now? Would I need to drive someone? Like, it was just to make sure at least we can move if we could. And I tried to get a train ticket for the night train that goes to Kyiv, and I got it, but then I couldn't make it to the train station that night because the Russians were already in our town. So they were driving heavy military equipment from Crimea, and there was fighting it's like in the city of Melitopol, which is like 20 minutes away from us. So my dad said, well, we're not going anywhere because it's obviously he was like, I don't even think the train is going to go anywhere. So I think we just have for now, just stay and see, how it's going.
It happened that fast.
Wow. We're 80 kilometers, I don't know, 50 miles away from Crimea. And it happened that fast. Because in the morning when I went to the petrol station around 7 a.m., there were a lot of cars and there were people talking that they've heard from relatives in Crimea that they crossed that illegal border that they put up when they annexed Crimea. And that's very close. So I was like, okay, well, they're going to be here very soon, in a way. We weren't sure how much fighting there will be there. Like, we were not sure, what's the Ukrainian, like, what's the situation like. But then towards the evening, it was already dangerous to move in and out. And we sort of waited. For the first couple of days, we had to go to the basement of our apartment because they were fighting. They put heavy machinery around our town, and they were shooting towards like Zaporizhia and towards other cities up north. And it was scary. I mean, it's kind of like everyone is just shell-shocked, and then the power was cut off. There were no internet for a couple of days, and you don't know what's happening. You're in a state of like, well, we don't know where, like, are they more in the east? What's happening in Kyiv? Like, what cities are still like ours? Like, what cities are still our cities? It was tough because it's just, it was also, it's kind of sad because people ask me, like, did you think it's going to happen ever, that it might escalate? And unfortunately, I did. It's sad to say. But I think seeing what has been happening in the eastern Ukraine for 8 years, I kind of thought that if they really wanted, they would invade further, or they would try to take over the southern regions. Yeah, so, and then at the beginning, well, obviously we're talking with my father because he said, well, I want you out, I want you to be safe. He didn't really want to leave at that point, and he still thinks he has lots of faith in Ukraine. He says, it's my town, it's my country, I'm not gonna go anywhere. So when I could actually evacuate, and the thing with evacuation was that there were no official routes. They tried to put some of them, the Ukrainian side, but it didn't really work. So I had to find somebody, who would take people out, like a driver, and who knows how to go, like who've been taking people. And I went with a driver, and there was a young mom with 2 of her kids, a 9-year-old boy and an 8-month-old baby in the car. And instead of an hour and a half to get to Zaporizhia, it took us almost 8 hours. And we went through 18 Russian checkpoints. So
literally, you went through Russian checkpoints.
Yeah, because I think around, I don't know exactly, 80% of the region is occupied.
Wow.
And they put their checkpoints. So in order to cross the last checkpoint and get to the next, the first Ukrainian one, we've counted that day, and it was 18 Russian checkpoints where they stop you, they search you. I mean, they can do anything, and it's military, like it's everything. Tanks, they were bringing up more missiles from Crimea. Just you drive with the military stuff coming in as you go, because this is not an official evacuation route. It's not safe. You kind of hope that it will be okay. And I mean, we were lucky, but there was a moment when, I looked at this young mother and I could see she was really worried. Like, she was afraid, and she asked me, she said, what if like they fire at us? Because she said, I've seen this in the news, like people were trying to evacuate and the civilian cars were shot at. And it's nothing I could tell her apart from that, we're already going. So it's kind of like, we just have to hope that we can, just make it, just cross that last checkpoint. And when we did that, and when we saw, a Ukrainian flag and our military, everyone just exhaled with such relief. And she called her mom and she said, Mom, we're in Ukraine. Like, that was the first thing she said. And she just started crying, like, on the phone, that, she's okay and the kids are out. And so that's how I made it to Zaporizhia. I took a train to Kyiv. I stayed for a couple of weeks in Kyiv, and then I came to Ireland. I mean, it's all kind of, I'm here for now. I'm staying with a friend, but it feels very strange.
Thank you for sharing, because it gives us a sense of the uncertainty, right? One can just imagine the anxiety, the fear, of not knowing what is going to happen next. Just the idea of going through all those checkpoints. Imagine the anxiety of the people in the car. I just wonder what that 9-year-old was thinking and going through, and how this is going to shape the rest of his life, right? This memory and this experience of fleeing with his mother and his sibling. So I Valeriya, thank you. We only have an hour and we can only try to cover so much, but it's helpful to hear firsthand and get a kind of a visceral feeling of what it feels like to be hanging out with your father and being awoken and saying, we're being bombed. And of course, that story rings very true for folks here in the Marianas. And so maybe we could pull in Galvin and Miguet as well, both living on Guam and Saipan, who have this long history of invasion, occupation, war, and we still have folks in our communities who have firsthand knowledge, just like Valeriya, of what that was like as a young person, to be, experiencing bombardment, to be experiencing, looking at a soldier, looking at, the realities of the war. So maybe we begin with Miguet, and also keeping in mind, friends, the question is not only war, but how storytellers like yourselves, how storytellers then try to understand the realities of war, and what questions you're asking and how you're deciding to use film as a vehicle to be able to elements of the story. And what would also be interesting for me is, as you're constructing those questions and those stories, how much of the audience are you thinking of? I'm always like, when you're writing a story, when you're telling a story, who are you telling it to? Because that determines how you tell the story. Are you telling it to young people? Are you telling it to people from outside of the Marianas, inside the Marianas? So, all right, brother.
Yeah. Oh, no, thank you. And Valeriya, I wanted to thank you for joining and for telling us your story. It was I just appreciate hearing that, and and I'm glad to be part of this panel to talk about this issue. As Dr. Johson mentioned, war is something that has absolutely shaped Guam. One of the films that I've worked on was called War for Guam. It was directed by the Puerto Rican director Francis Negron Montaner. And when we finally finished that film and it was released in 2015, she penned a column that was, basically asked the question, is the war in Guam over? And so the war, of course, ended, with some pen strokes and some countries making some treaties in the 40s and in the 50s. Fighting officially stopped a long time ago. But when you get into the history of it, I work at the Guam Museum. It took 28 years for the last Japanese soldier to be found in Guam's jungles. When you think about sort of Ordot Dump, the people who live in the village of Ordot, that dump was started with a bunch of munitions and waste which came from the war and was buried in the ground, and then a civilian sort of dump built on top of it. And when you think about the scars that people have, when Francis asked, is the war in Guam really over? It's an important question, because when does a war end? Does it end when empires decide to stop fighting each other and killing each other? Does it end when whatever land was taken is finally given back? What happens then when bases are built on those lands? What happens when agreements are made to give up those lands or that legitimize control over those lands? Does it end when the last person has a nightmare about that time? Right? And what happens then with intergenerational trauma? And so these things that you're discussing, these things that we're discussing on this panel, this is something which those who experience it directly, can only communicate so much in the words that they share, in the scars that they show, in the tears that they cry, right? But it is the task of filmmakers, artists, and others to try to take that so that lessons can survive from that. That sort of some wisdom can come from that, right? And so I think that's why in the Marianas you've seen a lot of filmmakers which have worked hard to take sort of the pain and the trauma that the war has given us and then use it to tell stories, to help us understand who we are, what we've lost in some cases, what we've gained in other cases. Sometimes, what are the things that we need to listen to our elders to learn? What are the things that we should carry on from them? And so I think that's an important task that filmmakers have, because even just thinking about, we've already mentioned sort of the idea of PTSD, right? And then thinking about the way in which films have really brought out different ways of describing and illustrating what trauma can look like, right? Where even a horror movie can show you sort of the trauma that somebody feels, right? That it can come out as a monster, sort of that's harassing a family, or that's harassing a people, right? Or that I think even of South Korean films where sort of the contamination from U.S. military bases, there's films in which that creates monsters, which then sort of vex the local populations, right? So film has a way of talking about these things even after they've been buried, even after, in some cases, they've been erased from history books, but the film can keep it going, keep people talking about it and thinking about it, and even put it into another form where that's always the beauty of art, right? Is that if you say something to somebody directly, they may disagree with you, they may not hear you, but art always has a way of reaching people in unexpected ways in which it can grab them, or hopefully it can slip them an epiphany, right, without them realizing it. And so that's why I'm grateful to be on this panel to talk about this issue, because I think this is something that local filmmakers in the Marianas have really tried to do in terms of taking the stories of our elders from their wartime experiences, putting it in a form that the next generation can understand it, right? That this is not just, here on Guam we have memorial walls. It's not just names on walls. It's not just sort of images in textbooks. These are people's grandmothers, grandfathers, aunts and uncles. And as you mentioned, Dr. Johson, there's still thousands of them left in the Marianas who can tell us their stories.
Yeah, you know, a couple of weeks ago, Miguel, I brought a class to the museum, and when I was driving home, I was like, I didn't stop in and say hi to Miguel. But anyway, we were standing at the end of the, you know, the Guam Museum has this incredible permanent exhibit, right? And every time I go, it gets deeper and deeper, and I get more and more emotional. And this time, I was in tears at the film, right? You start with this beautiful film. You start the journey through the exhibit. And my students at the end of the film, they're like, Dr. J, are you okay? What's going on? And I realized that it's because I've not only been here for a while, but also visiting this museum so often, that it takes a while for this story and this powerful film that the journey begins with, really touched me very deeply. But at the end, well, toward the end, before we go downstairs, there's this wall, like Miguel was saying, with all these names, 14, 15, 16,000 names of people that have died and suffered. And that's a very emotional point, because every class I take, they find their grandparents, right? These kids, and it's a huge wall, and it goes all the way to the ceiling, and so you can't really see all the way up and all, but with their cameras, they're able to zoom in. They know how to find their families, right? And this one girl was there also crying because she had zoomed in on her phone on her grandparents. And so, you know, talk about this, like 3 generations, right? And she was so emotional, and especially after going through this whole history of Guam, and to recognize that you walk through these images of war, World War II, and then you come out and she sees her grandparents' names.
Oh yes, and that's why the power of film to give textured, visceral, emotion to that, right? Because even if, let's say, you've heard a story from your grandparents about what they went through in war, that story, the tone of their voice, the quiver, it will be in your bones. It'll be in your flesh, right? But sometimes film can unlock that, even sort of making connections. And the thing is, that's the thing about trauma, is that trauma doesn't often make sense, right? That's why, for so long, even very smart people struggled with PTSD and trauma. They assumed that if somebody had trauma, you just needed to walk it off, you just needed to take some opium, you just needed to do this or that, but there is this thing called trauma that sort of persists in us from these experiences, right? And what do you do with it, right? And so filmmakers have this very, very particular blessed medium to combine all of these different sensory elements in a way which can unlock, right? And that's why, advertising can be super effective, but that's why, film can be super effective in just unlocking and touching those sorts of things, right? And so that's why, documenting these stories is so important, because when somebody who has taken that story from their elders, when they see it on film, even if it's not that exact same story, right? They can still feel echoes of that trauma, right? Because war has been around forever, right? And it takes different forms. It hurts people in different ways. The weapons change, right? But the violence has always been there, right? And so it is something which connects us to those specifically whose stories, whose blood we carry in us, but it also connects us to those who have suffered in other places, who have experienced the same thing. Valeriya, when you were mentioning your experience and going through checkpoints and stuff like, and the Ukrainian people being there, it definitely echoed from sort of the experiences that I've heard from my grandparents about being in sort of World War II occupied Guam. And so that's the power of film, is that a story need not stay with only those who have suffered or only those who have felt some of its trauma, right? It can travel, and and that's one of the ways that you deal with that trauma, is that it has to come out in some way, right? And sometimes it might come out in destructive ways, right? We've seen, coming from the Chamorro experience in World War II, we saw some people who had the trauma in them and they turned to abuse in their family, they turned to alcoholism. We had some families who just left Guam and never looked back because of what they had experienced, right? But we can always turn to art and artists to find other ways that that trauma can come out, so that those who it has consumed at a certain point in their lives need not feel that it has to consume them forever.
You know, filmmakers might not necessarily think of themselves as educators, but you're all really educators. And of course, your films and the filmmaking process can be very powerful for students to connect with history and their own understanding and relating it to their present lives. Maybe Galvin could speak to this question of how his experience with tears in particular, how it was connecting with his students, and then other things if you would like to share as well, Galvin.
And thank you very much, Dr. Johson. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me fine?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I've often said that I'm a filmmaker trapped in an educator's body. Valeriya, I just want to commend you for, you were at the outset, you were worried about not sounding coherent and together, but your experience that you shared is very visceral, very real. And I thank you very much. To Miguel's point about trauma, so, you know, the series of films that I've worked with, developed, I've produced and I directed a few. There are 5 films in the series and 9 stories, and they're all lifted from a book that I helped publish almost 2 decades ago. And the book was an effort to again engage the Manhoban, the young people of the Marianas, to talk with their elders, their Manumku, about the elders' experience in World War II. And the book itself has over 60 stories in it. And the title comes from one of the stories, and it really kind of speaks to the trauma that Miguel was talking about, and really resonates with what Valeriya was saying in terms of just trying to survive. And that is they were so thirsty, but there was nothing to drink, and all they had to drink was their tears. Wow. So that's where the title "We Drank Our Tears" comes from. And it's such a powerful statement, "We drank our tears," because on one hand, it's has deep figurative meaning about how they swallowed their pain, their trauma, and that actually became a form of nourishment, right? But also they were quite literally trying to survive, and that those are 2 very important elements or aspects of telling stories about the war. I mean, because most war stories are about soldiers, and you look at war movies, they're told from the perspective of soldiers. But I think what we've been seeing, particularly at the Guam International Film Festival, is a shift towards the civilian experience, and particularly in our case with "We Drank Our Tears," it's the experience of the indigenous Chamorros and Carolinians, the civilians, because they literally didn't have a dog in the fight. They were, right. We were first a Spanish colony, then a German colony, then a Japanese colony, and then now an American colony. We didn't invite any of this. We just happened to be here, right? So, so the book was published over 2 decades ago, and then we always knew we wanted to turn them into films. And what we've done with the book and with the films is each step of the way, we always bring it back to the Manhoban. We bring it back to our young people, and we engage them in the process. And what I've learned in doing that, and this is one reason why I love working with young people, is that it's proven to be very therapeutic. Earlier, Miguel, you mentioned, and also Dr. Johson, you mentioned that trauma is intergenerational, right? you inherit that trauma, whether it be through post-traumatic stress disorder, or maybe it's just the stories, but that trauma is passed on from generation to generation. And these kids, whenever they work on these films, not only do they have a deeper understanding and appreciation of what their families have experienced, but they have a connection. And one example in the story of Raphael Mufnes, the student that played him, Derek, we only learned after the film was premiered here on Saipan that Raphael Mufnes was his grandfather.
Whoa! Wow! Oh
yeah.
My gosh!
And what had happened was it had been such a traumatic experience that to kind of Miguet's point, you know, like, or you mentioned, Dr. Johson, like some people just moved, not violent, right? So one part of this family just didn't want to deal with it.
Wow.
So when he found out, it became they all watched the movie, and it became it was healing for them.
Wow.
And I think that's the beauty of film. Like I love watching movies and I love producing them, but I love making them work with others, because the spirit of collaboration and everyone trying to honor the story and do it justice and really, you know, because you're talking about people's families here and confronting trauma. So it's been very therapeutic for me as well. My grandmother, she's told us many stories about her experience in the war, but she's never wanted it chronicled. So in a way, to chronicle other stories helps honor her legacy. And so, yeah, I just think that in terms of dealing with that trauma, filmmaking as a process is also very therapeutic.
We're having a little internet challenges, at least on my end. I missed the last comment you made. Just the last comment, Galvin?
Oh, it is very therapeutic. It's just, it can be, the process itself can be very healing.
Yeah. Also, just this idea that, you know, the process of filmmaking requires so many people to step forward in so many different ways. I remember when Kel and Don made Shiro's Head, and they were reflecting on the process and how many people came forward to help, right? And this really builds on the incredible tradition, the cultural values and traditions of Micronesia and the Pacific here, is that whenever we do something, we do it collectively, right? Everybody comes forward in many, many different ways, and it becomes this incredible collective enterprise where the end product is as important as the process of getting there, right? Because it really it helps unify a community in telling this story. You might have a director and other key individuals, but ultimately, it's only possible, like Calvin was saying, is that you just have this huge community effort. Maybe we ask Valeriya to continue this conversation. I don't have a specific question, but it's been so wonderful to hear these thoughts about the process of filmmaking, and also reflecting on the powerful, you know, influence that war has had on people's lives over generations. I can't help but take this image that you've put in my mind about you in the car with this mother and two children going through this process. It'll be interesting to see what comes from your own work, Valeriya, what comes out of all of this. But go ahead.
Yeah, I think, I mean, at the time it was stressful because I had so many people writing to me and asking if I'm filming, and I think it was coming from a good place, but everyone was like, I almost feel guilty that I'm not recording anything, or I'm not, you know, talking to camera. But for me, in that moment, it just didn't feel like the right thing. And I think it goes back to your point of saying, well, if someone else came and said, we want to film you living occupied, can you add the, yeah, you can fall, like, you can do it. But for me, I think it was just too much. Like it almost felt unnatural to be recording myself or what I saw. I mean, it felt a bit dangerous, but also more that I just didn't feel that to tell this story, it's that way to do it, to just document me going through this. I almost feel I need a bit of more, it's going to be more of a reflection, a bit of thinking how it impacts, you know, different generations or people that I've met on the same journey. And I can't, you know, we're talking about World War II. I can't stop thinking about people that survived, who are older, who went through World War II in Ukraine, saying that they are reliving this trauma again through this another war. And people have shared so many stories of their grandparents or elder people who, you know, in their 90s who didn't survive the current occupation and war. How tragic that is. Because their whole life, you know, they were sort of these bearers of they were a kid during World War II, or maybe a teenager, maybe they fought in World War II, this story. And I remember at school, you know, we used to go and do these projects and interview these people and learning from them and how they were like, it's like, they always tried to kind of put that idea that that's, you know, the worst. You never want this to happen to you. And then they have to go through this whole horror thing again. And I almost feel it's twice for them because they now have their kids and their grandkids going through that experience. And it's just this whole dynamic of trying to figure out, you know, as a community and as a country, but also as a filmmaker, just feeling what story to tap into. Because I agree, I think a lot of films, I mean, back in college, you know, taking courses about cinema and war, a lot of them, especially from the last century, have to do with the combat. Like we see a lot of, you know, that kind of action. And I feel now, I mean, even in Ukraine, you see more of a micro stories of like a doctor, a kid, a postman, like something a bit removed, because I think there are always enough people and journalists filming at the front lines or filming stories about combat or people already writing screenplays about, you know, big action things that they can do. And I think there is more from the audience. They almost want to see a bit more like quiet, simple stories that they don't really get to see in the news. Or, you know, I get a lot of, I mean, I'm abroad and a lot of people ask me like, what's the situation, for example, with people who are, you know, LGBTQ community? Because they like, we know some of them are participating actively, you know, in the war, but we like don't really get to hear about them. What's that experience like? And I think that's interesting because that's opening, like you said, it's educating the rest of the world about this nuanced experiences of Ukrainians. Because I feel like we've been seen for a very long time through a post-colonial, through this colonial Russian lens, you know, post-Soviet, Soviet Union, all the film, like, you know, films were made in Moscow. Like a lot of Ukrainian films that were produced by Ukrainians were sought or presented as Russian films or by Russian filmmakers. And only now we're in the process of kind of also building a national cinema in a way. Like people are really fighting for the space to be able to tell those stories from our own perspective. So there's a lot happening. I think culturally, you know, and using cinema and images, there is just a lot in this different, you know, bits and pieces where people are trying to work. And I'm just still searching for. And I think I agree, it's very therapeutic. I'm just thinking in the process of getting there that I feel like, you know, I'm more or less processed and I could actually work on it in a more of a reflective, meditative state and not feel so, because I've done a project a couple of years ago about, you know, the occupation of Crimea and the war in Eastern Ukraine. And I just remember that editing that was very difficult because I could just feel very emotional about it. Just rewatching and rehearing and cutting that and showing it to people like for feedback. It's challenging to balance if it's very personal, like if it's lived experiences that you're dealing with.
But of course, the lived experience creates a very different film than someone else coming in to make a film, right? About a people. Or I remember, I'll never forget James Biernis's Facebook post from the gate at the airport in Hawaii when he was coming home. And this was at the time when North Korea was threatening to bomb Guam. And the gate was full of reporters, right? International reporters who were all very excited to come to Guam. And he was so frustrated, and it was a very emotional post, but it really touched on the reality of storytelling, right? From their perspective, where they were coming, they were going to stay at the Hilton, you know, hang out at the Tree Bar, talk to people behind the fence, and then get their stories and go home, right? And the reality of what this meant for the people of Guam would not be captured at all. So it's so important for folks like yourselves to be able to explore these realities through storytelling. Galvin?
No, I just, yeah, there's this, you have to be ready. You have to be ready. And so, Valeriya, I honor and respect you for when you are ready. Yeah, because it's you got to be ready for it, and because it is a collaborative process, like you were saying, Dr. Johson, and that's also part of the therapy, right? Is helping everyone process through it.
Yeah, the thoughtfulness is important. The reflective sort of process is very, very important, because nowadays, you know, a lot of people think that it's a film if it's just sort of like a cell phone camera of something, right? And so the need to sort of give it more context is so important, right? Because a video can be shared 10 million times before anyone realizes what it's about. And that's especially true nowadays in war, is that a video shared without context. And so, yeah, I definitely agree with that. And then, I mean, speaking to some of the other points that have been mentioned, you know, how you cover war is so important, because you don't want to necessarily glorify it, right? You don't want to turn it into action movies necessarily, in which sort of young people will, you know, I think about All Quiet on the Western Front as sort of one of those seminal books, which is a cautionary reminder that sort of the fantasies put into young boys at that time of sort of the glories of war, you know, they die. First thing to die on the battlefield. And so you don't want then to reproduce those fantasies, because, you know, rich and powerful people, governments, empires love those fantasies. Those are recruiting posters, you know, for them to serve, to die in other people's lands, to cross borders and take other people's homes. So that's why filmmakers of all types just have to be cautious and aware of that ethical responsibility too, right? Is that, you know, war is this thing that is always with us, but we can sort of create more possibilities for war. We can create generations which don't take it seriously. Think about drone warfare nowadays, and how, you know, we see in Ukraine it being used to sort of to push back against sort of the Russians, but we also see from the US perspective more and more people serving in the US Air Force and then dropping drones like video games in other countries, right? And so this is why the ethics of filmmakers are even more important nowadays, as we get used to just absorbing video and images everywhere.
You know, I grew up with this idea that was put into my heart and in my head very early on in my development, that gives a very hopeful view of the future, but also the requirements that will be needed, as, like I said at the beginning, as humanity goes through this adolescent stage of its development, to reflect, you know, a maturity that is based on unity and security. My teacher told me that the peace and the security of the world are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. And all my life, I've thought more and more about this concept of unity, and how when people ultimately recognize the oneness of the human family, this desire or this need to dominate will not be there. So even though we're going through these challenging times, really it's storytellers and artists that give hope to a world that, on the one hand, looks like it's getting worse every day, but there's this other incredible, constructive process that is also gaining momentum. Constructive process that is, so hopeful and gives young people a different vision of what the future might look like, and their role in creating that future. In the last few minutes, maybe we could just go around and have some concluding thoughts, and let's go ahead and start with Valeriya again, and then we'll go to Maguette and then Galvin.
Something I want to share actually is related to the documentary that screened in Guam last year, which at first might sound like it has nothing to do with me or Ukraine. It's a short documentary I made in New Zealand about a family from Tokelau that had to leave everything behind and move to New Zealand in the 70s because one of their kids was blind. And they were persuaded, by a TV doctor that, maybe they'll have a better life and get him treated. So they left everything behind, moved to New Zealand, didn't get treated, stayed there, but have this generational pain and sort of longing for, for their homeland. And a lot of people ask me, like, why, how did you connect with the family and community? Like, why would you make a movie? And I always say, because it seems that we're so far, because people are like, well, you're not from, you're from that part of, you're completely different. But I always have this appreciation and possibility to make connections with people and their experiences that might have nothing to do with you or your life or where you come from. And I just remember, meeting with the family and talking about it. Most of the time, we just ended up talking about our countries and about our cultures. They were so interested, they were probably the most interested people in New Zealand from everybody I met about my language, my culture, what's our relationship with the elders in Ukraine. And the same was for me. So I think some of this difficult experiences, I could relate because I know what it means to leave your home. I know what it means to live somewhere far away where, nothing is like what you used to be able to create this collective collaborative experiences. I mean, they become like my family, my best friends, and we share a lot. And I think it's so important that people's stories are being listened to and people's stories are being told, not from this outsider perspective, but sort of, I was able to do this. I thought it was so important, in this day and time to have more Pacifica stories told in New Zealand. And we spent a lot of time before we even filmed, just with the community, with them, because, as you say, I never wanted it to be something as, we come, we film, and we leave, because all we want is a story. Even if we have reasons we think it might be important. It was important to create an experience and a relationship that goes beyond the film. And that goes back to the point that, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, this kind of experiences make you relate to other people going through difficult times everywhere else in the world. And, to me, before and now, I feel people suffering everywhere else, obviously so much more, but I also almost feel like I know how to talk to them about it, where before I felt for them and I know what's, war has been around for 8 years, but I think often people, they can't, sometimes, when I walk into the room and people ask me where you're from and I say I'm from Ukraine, there's just silence in a way. And I know it's because people don't know, it seems so far away in safe countries and safe places that we just don't know how to talk about it. And I think it's so important to be able to talk to people about it respectfully, but also not be afraid to actually know more about it, be educated about it, ask things, be cautious about what we ask, Because I think sometimes retelling this experience can be re-traumatizing for people. Because obviously on one hand, we really want everyone to know, we want to share, we kind of want to, you know, tell, because we know a personal connection is different than reading about, you know, Valeriya living Ukraine somewhere on the internet in a text. It's like, who is this family, who is this person? But there is a bit of, you know, just being cautious that we ourselves are protective and taking care of ourselves, but also we know how to talk to other people that went through these experiences, even if we think, you know, I think it's better to still talk to them, that kind of switch a conversation and put it away and not think about it.
Thank you, Valeriya. Miguel?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Johson, Galvin, and Valeriya. Happy to be on this panel with all of you talking about this issue. If I could sort of say one thing in closing, you know, for those of you who, you know, these stories that we have from the Marianas, you know, we need to tell them. A lot of times, because we come from small islands that have a long history of colonization, we're very used to thinking that our story only matters if somebody from Hollywood buys it, turns it into a movie. If somebody comes, you know, from elsewhere and then sort of turns it into a book, you know, we need to stop waiting for that. And what's been inspiring about GIF is that it's pushed more and more local artists or potential artists, people who have the artistic inclination, but sort of may not have felt completely ready. It's pushed them to create, it's given them a reason to create, a platform, a venue, a way to focus sort of their creative aspirations, right? And so this is very true about our experiences here. Whether it's World War II stories, whether it's sort of continuing trauma, whether it's the fact that sort of Guam and the Marianas, you know, we are the buffer between the United States and its potential enemies in Asia. Sort of the experience of having missiles in China named for us. The fact that North Korea talks all the time about how they would totally bomb us to hurt the United States, right? What is this experience, right? What is this experience like? And so I encourage people, what I always tell sort of my students and those I talk to is, in Chamorro, "Angin tihita pues hadzi." If not us, then who? We need to stop waiting for others to sort of tell our stories for us. Let's take up the task ourselves.
Thank you, Miguel. Galvin.
Miguel, thank you so much for making that point, because one of the things for my last thought that I was thinking of was that the biggest movie to come out of the pandemic lockdown was Top Gun. And, you know, yeah, it's a good movie, but it glorifies war, but it does something even more pernicious. It creates an other. Those people that they shot down, you never see their faces. Right. They're not real people. And, you know, as Valeriya mentioned earlier about those personal connections, and as you mentioned, Dr. Johson, about unity, I think the Guam International Film Festival is such a fantastic alternative to Hollywood, where we're not trying to glorify war, we're not demonizing the other, we're trying to bring people together in you know, by telling each other's stories and really listening to each other's stories. So I feel very honored to be part of GIF for a number of years now, and especially to be able to meet wonderful people like you, Miguel, Dr. Johson, and Valeriya. So thank you for allowing me to share this space with you.
Thank you so much, all three of you. Thank you for this wonderful sharing, this wonderful space. And thank you for GIF for bringing us together and creating this opportunity to reflect on this subject. And so thank the organizers of GIF for these efforts that you continue to make. So I'm going to turn it back to Kyra now and back to the studio.
Thank you so much to our amazing panel, and thank you, Dr. Johson. This program is made possible by funding from Humanities Guåhan, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Federal American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. Any views expressed do not necessarily represent those of Humanities Guåhan or the National Endowment for the Humanities. We ask our viewers to take a few minutes to complete a short survey. The link will be inserted in our chat box on both our Zoom and Facebook platforms. Join us next week, October 7th at 10 a.m. for our next panel on representation in film. For those of you watching us on Guam, please join us. We are back at the Guam Museum this October 7th to 9th, 2022. For more information about all things GIF, please visit our website at www.guamfilmfestival.org. On behalf of the panelists and the rest of our GIF team, thank you and see you all next time.